predicated on the theft of land, the theft of labor, and the theft of Black women's reproductive autonomy. Although they want us not to say it, not to lift it up, not to incorporate it in our understanding of who we are, we know that we cannot understand what we're facing without understanding that history. These are the facts that the MAGA extremists behind the witch hunt of CRT want to erase into silence. But it's not just that history, and it's not just MAGA that wants to silence these ideas. There are those others who have acquiesced to the silencing. Even when we discuss, for example, the January 6th insurrection, the racist and white nationalist underbelly that informed this idea that we want our country back is often rendered pretty much a footnote to what happened the day that we almost lost our democracy. This ensures that the centrality of the racist narratives about who this country really belongs to, who gets to decide, who has a legitimate place in deciding who will govern us, will never be fully interrogated unless we tell the truth about what it meant that that Confederate flag was marching through the Capitol that day. Unless we tell the truth about all of the language and the memes that actually created the narrative of the stolen election. And let's think about who they say was doing the stealing. Where is the focus of Trump's ire? What are the cities that he says were the cities that denied him his rightful place? Well, let's think about it. Atlanta, Philadelphia, Detroit, Milwaukee, Phoenix. Who were the voters that denied him a return to the White House? Who were the poll workers who were assaulted and threatened because of the claims that are being made that were notably false? What were the symbols that allowed that targeting to become part of a racial narrative that then was not elevated? It was not interrogated. So when our president basically ended up saying, this is not who we are, made me wonder, what history are you aware of? Because this is exactly who we are. It's exactly who we have been. So Jamie Raskin notes that that Confederate flag is a reflection of MAGA's common cause with extremist groups steeped in racism and hell-bent on insurrection. But we haven't normalized the capacity to have this conversation. So we avoid it. We allow people to remove it from our textbooks. We allow extremists to say, we can't afford to talk about this past, this legacy, because it'll make our kids feel bad. This anti-woke assault on race-conscious history, knowledge, along with the assault on some of the hard-fought victories, not just Title VII, but the entire apparatus that has been created to create equal opportunity, to create diversity, equity, and inclusion. All of these things are on the chopping block. And the reason they are there, the reason why this war against CRT, against Black history, is a war against our democracy itself. We cannot save one without the other. So lately, people have been debating whether fascism could ever happen here, without acknowledging that for racialized people, as the great poet Langston Hughes wrote, we are the people who have long known in actual practice the meaning of the word fascism. We Negroes in America do not have to be told what fascism is in action. We know. The celebrated writer Toni Morrison, writing across the decades, explained how the creation of a pariah class was one of the first steps of fascist regimes, where they create an enemy and then they, quote, isolate and demonize that enemy by unleashing and protecting the utterance of overt and coded name calling and verbal abuse. Sound familiar? So it's not simply ironic that not only Hughes, but Morrison, the Nobel Prize winner, often called the most celebrated American author of the 20th century, have both been censored and labeled divisive. Morrison is one of the most banned writers in the country today. Toni Morrison. The fact that she was so prophetic in telling us what this crisis means is all the more reason that our response to censorship should be reflexive. If they want to take it away, it means we must go to the mat all the more to hold on to it, to protect our legacy. What is at stake now is more than a book, a theory, a practice, or a value. What is at stake is our democracy. But of course, we can't address what we cannot see. We cannot fix what we're not allowed to name. So that is the question before us now. I want to pull into the conversation Derek Bell, who once wrote that we only make progress when there is convergence between the interests of people of color and the interests of the dominant race. We might be at that inflection point right now. Because one thing we know, the majority of Americans really don't want that bad thing to happen here. The majority of Americans really do want to have a democracy, but there is something in their way. And we see what that is now that the leading vice president, soon to be presidential nominee, is being called the DEI president. Racist and sexist tropes are being rolled out every day against her. So now those who want a different way have got to figure out how to decode that racism. They have to figure out how to lift up DEI. They have to figure out how to do something about the misinformation that is allowing Vice President Kamala Harris to be framed in such a way. So what that means for us is that the connection between anti-racism, between anti-sexism, between all of the isms and the future of our democracy has never been more clear. The question is, are we able to read it? The question is, can we develop the literacy to pass on to everybody else who needs to know and understand why this election is the most important one of our lifetime and what we need to be able to understand to act accordingly? So today we've got a spectacular panel of folks who just happen to be friends and collaborators to help us unpack what's at stake, how history informs this moment, and how literacy about that history is the pathway forward. So you've seen him everywhere, laying the gospel of social justice on television, on the radio, and in pulpits. Now, he competes with Tim Wise in coming the shortest distance to be with us. He lives around the corner. Please welcome Michael Eric Dyson, the University Distinguished Professor of African American and Diaspora Studies and the University Distinguished Professor of Ethics at the Divinity School at Vanderbilt. Now, y'all know he drops a book every 6 months, so I'm not going to list all of them, but I will lift up his 2020 book, Long Time Coming, Reckoning with Race in America. We're delighted that Professor Dyson will be leading a week-long intensive titled Genealogies of Anti-Blackness, where he will be discussing some of the themes of his book and more about the topic of today's plenary. Nancy MacLean is our policy whisperer, the prophet who lifted our eyes to Project 2025 last year. She is the William Chafe Professor of History and Public Policy at Duke University and author of the critically acclaimed 2017 book, Democracy in Chains, the deep history of the radical rights stealth plan for America. Professor MacLean will also be offering a week-long intensive, bringing the themes of her book into conversation with the current threat of Project 2025. Please join me in welcoming her to the panel. Arriving just this morning after a Herculean effort to get here is Jason Stanley, the Jacob Urowski Professor of Philosophy at Yale University and author of the forthcoming book, Erasing History, How Fascists Rewrite the Past to control the future. Students in his week-long intensive will learn more about how the anti-woke assault on education is much more than a fit of spite from parents' rights group. We overlook this threat only at our peril. Please welcome Jason Stanley. And finally, please welcome Kevin Kumashiro, an internationally recognized expert on educational policy, school reform, teacher preparation, and educational equity and justice. The former dean of the schools of education at the University of San Francisco and Hofstra University, he is the author most recently of Surrendered: Why Progressives Are Losing the Biggest Battles in Education. Please join me in welcoming Professor Kumashiro. So to engage with us throughout the panel, please visit www.menti.com. That's Menti, MENTI.com. Use the code 1779851. That's 1779851. Once you type in this code, you'll be taken to a page where you can share your thoughts, your comments, and we hope to incorporate your insights in our conversation. So I'm going to start by asking Nancy to give us a picture of Project 2025, just sort of a collage, because I know people have heard a lot of things about Project 2025. I'm pretty sure no one has read 900 pages of this madness. But there's a lot in it that we need to know that is particularly resonant with the theme of this conversation. So Nancy, take it away for us.
Great. Well, first of all, it is absolutely wonderful to be with this community in person for the first summer school in person. Just so happy to be with you. Project 2025 is the detailed blueprint to implement the kind of counter-revolution against multiracial, gender-inclusive democracy that Professor Crenshaw was just describing. It is a detailed, ruthless, step-by-step blueprint to be imposed in the first 180 days of a Trump presidency, a blueprint that would make the president all-powerful, to take away our freedoms, to roll back the hard-won victories of generations, and to impose their dogma on all Americans. This is a coalition between predatory capitalists, white supremacists, and Christian nationalists. Not that those categories are mutually exclusive. So what would it do? It would unleash the Republican president from any serious restraints, giving Donald Trump, or whoever would be there instead of him for any reason, the powers of the dictators he so admires, like Viktor Orban of Hungary. How would it do that? Well, one thing it would do is give the president control, political control of the Department of Justice and the FBI, so he can use them as his personal minions. So too, Project 2025 promises to get rid of human obstacles in government, like the career civil servants who held Trump to a modicum of the decency and observance of law in his first term. I don't have to remind this audience that generations of African Americans who face discrimination from private employers achieved mobility through public sector employment. Project 2025 takes a wrecking ball to that mobility escalator. It calls for converting some 50,000 federal service jobs to political appointees that will go to Trump loyalists. They're already taking applications for what the director of the project calls, and I quote, an army of aligned, vetted, trained conservatives to go to work on day one after the existing career employees are purged. To drive home that MAGA plans to make government white and male again, Project 2025 calls past participation in a DEI program, quote, per se grounds for termination of employment. So too do Project 2025's authors seek a national abortion ban and to end the availability of medication abortion, mifepristone. They also aim to impose what the plan calls, and I quote, a biblically based definition of marriage and family. So goodbye to marriage equality and to equal citizenship for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender queer Americans. Project 2025 also calls for abolishing the Department of Education. That would make it easier to undermine public schools and shift funds to the private Christian academies that can teach any nonsense they want. It also calls for the complete end of Head Start. Forget public health. This is the crew that has tried to repeal the Affordable Care Act since its passed. Project 2025 would prohibit the Centers for Disease Control from even recommending the vaccination of school children or requiring any other public health measures in schools as we face the possibility of future pandemics. It will make censorship the law of the land. All of America would be subject to the kind of don't say race, don't say gay laws enacted in Florida, Tennessee, and other MAGA-run states. It would also completely stop all federal climate action efforts and dismantle environmental protections that fossil fuel and other dirty corporations don't like. Project 2025 is so authoritarian that if its recommendations are adopted, no one in government will even be allowed to use the words, and again, I quote, gender identity, gender equality, abortion, reproductive health, or reproductive rights. That, using those words, would be grounds for firing. I could go on because there are over 900 pages of such plans in the document, which the authors call not the conservative idea, not the conservative threat. No, they call it the conservative promise. This is what we will do if we get the White House. Altogether, it amounts to a kind of shock doctrine of fascist measures to be imposed within the first 6 months after inauguration. So this is what we were up against. And as Representative Jones said so well last night, if you doubt that this radicalized MAGA party would impose this agenda, all you have to look to is the states they dominate, like Tennessee, where we're meeting, Florida, that we know so much about, North Carolina, where I live, Alabama, Mississippi, the White Mountain West, et cetera. They are putting these measures in practice now as laboratories, and they will take this national if they win this election.
Thank you so much, Nancy. So, I told you all she was the policy whisperer. So as we have been organizing for Freedom to Learn, Nancy was the one that would remind us, we can create a winning coalition because Project 2025 has a horror in it for every constituency, absolutely everyone. And you've just heard the tip of the iceberg. Let me throw in the elimination of the EEOC.
Yes.
Basically, they're not about trying to create equal opportunity at all. It's not a difference of an opinion. It's we don't like it at all. Eliminating the ability to collect data,
yes,
racial data. So an entire part of anti-discrimination law turns on disparate impact. But guess what? You can't show a disparity if you can't collect the data.
Yeah.
You can't tell a story if you don't have any numbers to back you up. So they're just going for the jugular. Let's take away their ability to make any claim about discrimination by taking away access to the information upon which the claim would be grounded. So this is going for the jugular. We need to understand that. We also need to understand then the relationship between the history out of which this comes and as Nancy mentioned, the fascist dimension of this. So Michael, I want to come to you. Folks, Black folks, activist Black folks have long known about the interconnected forces of racism and fascism. Now we know you have the receipts. So help us paint a picture for the audience from politics, from education, from culture that are examples of this connection that we're seeing today.
Right. Well, thank you so much. And it's great to be here on this great panel with the legendary Kim Crenshaw. It is true that racism is a dry run, a dress rehearsal for fascism. Every concern generated in the context of fascist ideology has been both precipitated by and preceded by stuff that's done to Black folk, but that didn't count. We didn't see it as fascist that Black people literally couldn't vote. Now, we know when they got here, even before 1619 in a few states in the mid-1500s, and in the 1600s, Black folk here and there, smattering here, could vote, then couldn't vote. It was a fluid situation, but most especially after the hegemony, the dominance of white supremacy gets instantiated, gets instituted, gets delivered as state practice and official political belief, then we see that Black people can't vote, right? We know under a fascist regime, you ain't got no power to be able to determine the institutions which govern your life. Secondly, in terms of education, right? They made it impossible for Black folk to be educated. And then when they were educated, they gave them some religious dogma and allowed them to reinforce the prevailing ethic of white supremacy through an evangelical politic that reinforced the dominance, the naturalness of white supremacy and the natural inferior state of Black people. And we know across the board, this is what's happening under fascist dictators, autocrats, and people who want to control the distribution of knowledge. This is why they got to erase history. We know that Professor Stanley is writing about this in his new book. They have to erase history because if you find out what they actually did, you be mad because you find out, and especially they aim at young white folk, they don't want young white folk to know. They're not so much concerned about Black people learning Black history. They don't want white young people to know about it because then they go home for Thanksgiving and go, what's up? So the truth is that the historic legacy of white supremacy has to be erased and eradicated so that present practices can be seen outside the box, antithetical to democracy, and subverting the very common will that Benjamin Franklin said should inform the society. And then finally, when you think about religion itself, using God to co-sign your bigotry, using God to make God look like the author of every transgender, transphobia, homophobia, racial phobia. The anti-Blackness is deeply inscribed in the gospel if God stands above history to say what you're doing is wrong. So when you look at those three instances of the ways in which racial dominance has preceded fascism and is an accomplice to the very ends that are asserted there, you can see the relationship between the two.
Beautiful, beautiful. And of course, we can't fail to mention the religious dogma behind the idea that some of our bodies are not free for us to decide when we want to reproduce and when we're not. Right.
Absolutely.
So it's all part of that precursor. Jason, I want to come to you. As we mentioned, your forthcoming book, Erasing History, How Fascists Rewrite the Past to Control the Future, not only tells a story about the rise of authoritarianism globally, but also in this country. So some people have always considered the F word to be something that happens over there, right? Something that can never happen and has never happened in the home of the free and the land of the brave. So help us understand then how this current movement to erase history in America reflects the homegrown face of an insurgent fascism unfolding here. And I guess, we do have to go to first principles because a lot of people throw the F word around. I mean, the FA word. So let's start with just an operating definition of fascism so we can understand how erasing history helps facilitate it.
So I was going to begin with the Langston Hughes comment about Jim Crow, but you stole it from me. So
you can say it again. It's so good.
well, I want to begin somewhere else because your comment about freedom made me think about Toni Morrison's point of Toni Morrison about what freedom discourse so often means in the United States. It can only be understood, she says, if you think it's predicated on the unfreedom of other people. So if you think about the image of an American settler in Manifest Destiny going west, that's our image of freedom, a settler with the caravans or whatever they call them, the covered wagons. They're free, right? But that very freedom is predicated on indigenous dispossession. So you can't even conceptually imagine it. So fascism, to go back to Michael's point about the history, Hitler took the United States in Mein Kampf to be the model of a fascist country, to be his model. He said, we want to build a national state based on race like the United States has done. So now, going to the working definite, and I'm going to prevent myself from reciting all the antecedents in the United States, the European fascism, but we should get more credit for fascism. That's all I'm saying. We can think of a working definition of fascism as a cult of the leader who promises national restoration after supposed humiliation by immigrants, feminists, liberals, and Marxists. The leader says the nation's been humiliated. It's on the decline by immigration. Is usually the immigration and LGBT are usually the two focus points of the humiliation of the nation. And then some topic like the World War I. Hitler said Jews lost World War I for Germany. They betrayed Germany, the stab in the back myth. Now we have an election, right? As Timothy Snyder has said, the victimhood, the stab in the back is the stolen election. So the idea is the leader is going to take revenge for all of this. Now, we've always had fascist practices and fascist culture here. That's Toni Morrison's point in her essay, Racism and Fascism, with which Professor Crenshaw started us off. But what we haven't had is a cult of the leader yet. We haven't had that structure. Fascism makes a distinction between first and second class citizens. We've all had that with race here, but what we need, what we now have is a more classically fascist structure. And I'm just going to end by pointing out the most clearly fascist leader right now is Vladimir Putin. And a couple months ago, he said, wars are won by teachers.
Whoa. Whoa. So I'm gonna let you hold the mic on that one. And say a little more, because okay, here's the way the media have framed, this parents' rights sort of grassroots opposition to what they may have overheard from their little Zoom moments when their kids were being taught something. These are just parents being concerned about indoctrination, about their kids feeling bad. Liberals and leftists have gone, way too far in distorting our historical identity and narrative. And so this is framed as just taking back what has been distorted. So that's sort of the picture. Now, the media might say, yeah, maybe it's true, maybe it's not true, but this is how they're framing what the controversy is all about. Has wokeness gone too far? Your frame suggests that this is a much deeper threat, a much more serious undertaking, and they are not yet connecting the dots in the way you're suggesting between this apparent parents' rights thing and the worship of, a supreme leader. So help us connect the dots between, what appears to be just a parents' rights thing and the bigger picture that you're laying out.
Well, first of all, which parents? You know, it's the parents of kids in the dominant group. Now, when we think about fascism, we think about Nazi Germany and we think of denazification, that they are facing their past, but we're facing a worldwide fascist movement now. Germany's most popular party, or second most popular party, is saying exactly this. They're saying we should be proud of our past. We should not teach the Holocaust anymore. We shouldn't be so ashamed of this. Now, the rest of the world is more aware. I mean, that's obviously something, you know. So when we think about what's going on here, we should think, yeah, in Germany, they're saying, okay, the Holocaust wasn't so bad. You got to understand it in context. So what's happening when you erase history is you erase possibilities to even out. Well, there's one very easy example: erasing the history of social movements. China, it's illegal to teach about Tiananmen Square. So you never learn if you grow up in China that a group of students tried to push for democracy. That is illegal to teach. I believe in Florida, Black Lives Matter is illegal to teach for the same reason. So you eliminate the history of social movements. So people think that the hierarchies of the status quo are permanent and unchallengeable. The focus on LGBT and women's rights is very central as well, because fascism is all about replenishing the dominant group's babies. And so, you know, Hitler says the goal of education for women is to teach women their role as mothers. We're seeing rigid gender roles. We're seeing the structure. We're seeing the idea that hierarchy is permanent. And once you've got, and that's all anti-democratic, because hierarchy is inconsistent with equal respect. And then you don't know if you don't know who's been denied freedom in the past and who's been denied equality, then you don't know what you're going to have to do to realize those democratic ideals.
Exactly. So Kevin, so Nancy, Michael, and Jason have laid out how one of the key sites in the battle over democracy and education is taking place inside of public education. So as a professor of education, what examples stand out for you as the contemporary illustration of the connection between racism and what Jason is describing here?
Yeah, I was thinking recently about, I was in a conversation with one of my former colleagues who is very fair-skinned with blonde hair, couldn't be mistaken as anything but white, as she would say. And she said AI's facial recognition thought she was Black, which we all know that facial recognition from AI is often off when it comes to race. I bring this up because this was in a conversation where a bunch of higher ed leaders were talking about what's the future of higher ed. And you know what? Some of the consultants were arguing that the future of higher ed rests on its ability to embrace AI and everything it does. And we know that this is happening all over education, right? Lesson planning, how we do admissions, how we assess students, and blah, blah, blah. All right. So the reason I bring up this story is because I feel like this turn to AI reflects is just the latest of decades of repeating the story over and over again that public education is failing, and what's going to save us is something outside, whether that's AI and big tech, or that's scripted curriculum, or that's high stakes testing, or that's privatization, or that's vouchers, and so on. And the Democrats often buy into this. We have some wonderful scholarship by scholars like George Lakoff, who argues that the political right has been most effective at pushing agendas precisely when they're able to frame their messages in ways that sound commonsensical. So as I try to name this moment and what's happening in education, I thought I'd share 4 very quickly overlapping narratives that underlie some of what Nancy was talking about in terms of Project 2025. And they all come from the same time period of the 1950s to the 1980s. So the first is the ascendancy of neoliberal ideology, and this is most seen in education with the pushing of vouchers. And here we hear the message that the public sector is failing and marketization and the private sector will save us. I think it's really important, as some of us were talking over lunch, that we often think that our job is to debate the policy initiatives, but often what we actually need to do is look at where the policy initiatives came from, because they point to the ulterior motives of those pushing those initiatives, right? Vouchers, hence, gets often embraced by Democrats. They're some of the loudest proponents right now, but vouchers were always about privatizing public education. The second history I point to is the emergence of the conservative movement. And here, the building of the infrastructure that was largely a response to the gains of the civil rights movement. Some of you may know that hand in hand with the civil rights movement and the federal era in education, we saw gains in advancing equity and closing gaps because of desegregation, more equitable funding, multicultural curriculum, and affirmative action. Here we hear the narrative that the big brother will weaken us and anti-racism and DEI initiatives will divide us. The third history happening all at the same time is the strengthening ties between government and business. And this is largely in response to what is often called the heyday of public sector organizing, 1960s and 70s. And who led over 1,000 strikes in that 12-year period? It was teachers, right? And by the way, some of you may also know that some of the main organizers in civil rights movement, in women's rights movement, and for decades in labor movement have been communist. And that's why union is often criticized as communist. But the message I want to point out here is that communism and socialism is antithetical to American values, is often the message. And that then leads to my fourth point, is we see that in these decades, we see the strengthening ties. I'm going to be half a more minute. The strengthening ties between the government and the Christian right also characterizes this moment. So the 60s and 70s, including in education, we see two strategies by the Christian right: re-Christianization and deinstitutionalization. And those two things should sound very familiar because it lays the groundwork for what we see now. We often talk about Christian nationalism. What's actually a better term to talk about what's happening now is Christian dominionism, right? It's preparing the world for the second coming of Christ by taking over all institutions and culture. And this is very much at the groundwork of Project 2025. So my argument is, let's connect the dots across all of these different narratives and social movements as a way to more deeply understand the moment that we're in.
Thank you, Kevin. And I had a moment of PTSD when you talked about Christian dominionism preparing for the second coming. I confess to having gone to a fundamentalist Christian school for 3 years, and these people are serious about this. Like it's going to happen. We need to get ready for it. Eventually, my parents figured out having a brother who was sort of quasi Black Pantherist in his ideology, and I would go to school and repeat it, was probably not the best place for me to be. but it always sticks with me that behind this sort of, Christian will all overcome is a particular vision for where people like me are meant to fit into that. So that leads me to, I guess, sort of how should we take this? How should we feel about it? Because there's one way in which it sounds like that's just some crazy stuff. It'll never happen. Right. I think a lot of people kind of, and then on the other hand, for some of these issues, like you pointed out, the Democrats, they're split on the question of vouchers. We might have a vice president candidate who actually is a big pro voucher person. So I guess the question is kind of, what is the wolf and what are the clothes, right? What should we really be afraid about right now and committed to reaching some kind of consensus to fight? Because we don't seem to have consensus right now about what's going on in public education. And that has been, the Trojan horse that allows the right to advance an agenda that is counter to everything we claim to believe in.
Yeah, it's a scary moment when people you think would be the champions of kind of justice are actually pushing forward the proposals that came from the other side, right?
Yeah.
And yes, as I was thinking about, who might Harris name as her running mate, I think about also when Trump was elected. Do you all remember, or did you all see this article that was titled, "Don't like DeVos? Blame the Democrats"? And basically what this article was arguing was that the Democrats, particularly under the Obama and Duncan administration, really laid the groundwork for normalizing privatization and so on in public education. So I know that in the introduction, one of my books was mentioned, and the subtitle of this book is "Why Progressives Are Losing the Biggest Battles in Education." And my short answer to that is often progressives are losing the biggest battles because we're failing to reframe. That I think we're buying into the wrong stories. We're not taking the time to do our own homework, whether that's to, like everything that we're doing in this conference, like erasing history and sort of trying to think about how do we historicize, how do we connect the dots, how do we look intersectionally at things. And what I would say as a counter to this is to think about how, as we were saying sort of a little bit earlier, these struggles are not merely struggles over policy. Like Project 2025 to me is not just a laundry list of education policy. What I think it's trying to do is say, here's how we orient education in order to build the kind of society that we ultimately want to build. So this is really a struggle over society. And, you know, the questions we should be asking are things like, what do we think education should look like in a fascist state? And, you know, some of us might say something like, oh, well, the elite would get something really well-resourced and awesome with these well-prepared teachers and rich curriculum, and the masses would get something watered down and sort of teaching to conform and impoverished schools. And, you know, basically, I just described what things look like in the educational system here. So what we need to be asking is, so what then, if we wanted to build an educational system that's working towards democracy, well, what is it that we think that educational system should be? And that's, I think, the overarching questions that should be driving our debates. It's important to dive into the policy battles, but it's also really important to clarify the vision of the kind of society we want to build towards, and then think about what the educational system we need will get us there.
Thank you for that. So Nancy, I want to come back to you because, you know, you're a historian, and history is the thing that they're trying to erase. So there must be something in there, right, that we need to enhance our literacy of this moment. So where do we have to go back in history to understand some of the parallels of this moment, particularly in light of Project 2025? Why, or to get the story about why this is so menacing and dangerous?
Yeah, we could go back to the segregationists who fought the civil rights movement, or to the American Liberty League that opposed the New Deal. We could do all of that, but I find myself these days continually going back to the 1850s. Why the 1850s? Because it was so like our time in important ways. It was a time when abolitionists, after working so hard, you know, for decades by then, making the case against human enslavement, were starting to despair. They didn't see how they could break through in this country. The enslavers completely controlled the national government, okay? They had such power over Congress that they were able to have a gag rule that made it so that petitions coming in from anti-slavery abolitionist Americans couldn't even be read in Congress, couldn't be acknowledged, just like all the knowledge suppression we're seeing today. You couldn't even have those petitions as a condition of Congress functioning. Also, they were so very powerful that abolitionists thought they could never be unseated from power. The militant Southerners then forced Congress, after that gag rule, to pass a federal Fugitive Slave Act in 1850. It compelled every Northerner to help enslavers and bounty hunters capture escaped men, women, and children, and many free African Americans, and send them back to their masters, or face steep fines and jail time themselves, just like the anti-protest stuff, criminalization we're seeing now. So the slave power in Congress then set off bloody guerrilla wars, battles in Kansas and Nebraska by trying to force these territories to allow enslavement. Then the slave power's cronies on the Supreme Court issued the vile Dred Scott decision that declared that even free African Americans had no citizenship rights. Determined to perpetuate slavery and white supremacy, the slave power then set off the bloodiest civil war in the history of the Western Hemisphere. After emancipation, it was that same faction that came from the slave power that spawned racial capitalism enforced by violence, that spawned massive resistance to Brown versus Board of Education, and that engaged in attacks on nonviolent SNCC members during the 1964 Freedom Summer that we are commemorating. It ran Barry Goldwater, Ronald Reagan, and now Trump. So for me, as a historian, this is the lineage I look back to, but it is also the dynamics that I think we need to understand, because there is also an upside to this that I could talk about.
Yes. And thank you for that connection, the arc of that. And let me just meditate on this for a moment, because you mentioned how the Supreme Court authorized a counter-revolution.
Yeah.
I mean, authorized the highest court of the land. basically allowed the consequences and the outcome of the Civil War to be unraveled, you know, through the interpretation of law. So when we look at the parallels, right, we're looking at a moment where the Supreme Court has basically said that Trump is basically immune.
Yeah.
We're looking at judges that are basically letting him off the hook. We're looking at political power lining up in such a way that even the fantasy of the rule of law is basically not constraining this raw exercise of power. So for those who think it cannot happen here, for those who think there are, you know, barriers, there's something to keep us from going off the rails, the rails are disintegrating in front of our very eyes.
Yes.
Right. So of the many questions we might look to history to understand, one may be, what is it that allows people to see these barriers, you know, sort of deteriorating and thinking that's not about me. That's not going to undermine my interests.
Yeah.
I like this guy. He's made promises, or I like this faction. This faction is out for our interests. What is it about, you know, I keep remembering this line from a movie that I saw Sidney Poitier in with he and or was it Harry Belafonte? The last two people on the planet. It was Harry Belafonte, and the white woman says, "I'm free, white, and single," or something like that. And we're like, wow, you're even at the end of the earth. You know, it's over. And whiteness is still sitting in your head thinking at the end of the day, but I'm white. So is there a piece of that?
Stevens. But she was married to a black man in real life.
I play one on TV. But, so the continuity, the way that this faction has been able to capitalize on that. Who is it? Lee Atwater on his deathbed basically said, look, this is modern politics. We can't say the N-word, but we sure can say no more money for welfare. We can say no more busing. We can say no taxes. So this is such a page from history that's repeating itself again and again. And again, right?
Well, here's the good part. Because one of the reasons I like to go back to the 1850s is because of the way things changed. That history has something really encouraging to tell us. You mentioned, Professor Crenshaw, you mentioned Derek Bell earlier and his theory of interest convergence. You could hold up by the end of the 1850s, probably our most profound case of that. And that is that precisely because this property supremacist, white supremacist faction seeks total domination, right? No compromise. We want to rule. We want to dominate. Nobody else is good. It always oversteps. Always. And it is its own worst enemy in this regard because its grotesque power grabs expand the ranks of the freedom movement, okay? So it wasn't, in fact, abolitionists alone who won over the Northern majority by 1860 in some kind of direct way to being anti-slavery. It was the enslavers who did that, right? Against the backdrop of all the abolitionists organizing the kinds of things that we're doing here now, our version of this. But their outrages, the enslavers' outrages, showed those white male voters that their own freedoms were no longer safe in the North, in their country. They thought they didn't care about African Americans. It was, so what? That's going on in the South. You know, I got a little business here. I got a farm. I'm doing this. Everything's great. And then that Fugitive Slave Act told you had to be a slave catcher, or you were going to go to prison, or you were going to face a fine. Your petitions couldn't be read. Your wife collected those for weeks on end from all your neighbors. Everybody signed up to say they were against slavery and bring it to the government that was supposed to be of the people and for the people, and they wouldn't even hear them, right? Then the Dred Scott decision, then Bleeding Kansas, they called it, because so many people were being killed in these fights for the enslavers trying to make territories that were supposed to be free, slave territories. So these acts in the 1850s were like lightning bolts that woke up most white Northern voters to how the slave power wasn't going to stop at African Americans' freedom. They were going to take everybody's freedom. And they were going to transform the United States from what its original promise was, as limited as that was, into a place where slaveholders could dominate everyone. And that is when power flipped. And that is when Lincoln was elected. And the rest is history. So I want to say something here too, because there is also social learning, movement learning on our side. Dr. King understood this dynamic very well, very profoundly. And it is what he meant when he observed, and this is so profound, white America likes segregation, but it cannot stomach segregationists. Right? That's why he picked fights with the likes of Bull Connor in Birmingham, to make white America see what it was siding with, so it would recoil, right? So he practiced jujitsu, right? You use your opponent's power against them to flip them and change the situation. Bob Moses and the other SNCC inner team knew this too. That's why they went to Mississippi. They went to Mississippi because Mississippi could make white Americans who were craning their necks away, make them see what they were refusing to see. So that's why I believe that MAGA has given us, perversely, it is perverse, but MAGA has given us a great gift with this project 2025, because we can jujitsu this, just like our predecessors jujitsu those grotesque power moves. We can use Project 2025 to show others who these people really are and what this election is really about, that it is existential and it is about democracy versus authoritarianism. And it is plain as day when you dig into Project 2025.
So, Michael, I'm gonna come to you to talk about both the conditions of the possibility that we're sitting in now, and what we have to grapple with in order to take advantage of the jujitsu possibility, right? So, part of the condition of possibility, it is unlikely that this faction could have on its own, over the course of history, overturned Reconstruction, limited the scope of Brown versus Board of Education, pushed back against the 2020 racial reckoning, in which there was protest in every state in the union, all 50 states, multiracial, intergenerational, demanding of accountability. Felt like we were in a moment, right? 4 years later, that has so unraveled that even the places that had weak DEI initiatives, weak commitments to racial justice, have said, you know what, we even done with that, right? So, number one, what is it about our allyship with various folks, and I'm not just saying folks of a different color, I'm also saying that the skin folk who ain't kinfolk, or kinfolk who, that whole thing. What are the conditions under which we were unable to sustain Reconstruction, unable to sustain equity and equality in the 60s, unable to sustain 2020? What are some of those conditions? And then I'm going to come back and ask, okay, so what can we do to try to grab that energy? Right.
No, I mean, and to build on what everybody's, been talking about, from the brilliant genealogy of Reconstruction, post-Reconstruction, enslavement, and what people did. And then, Brother Stanley's argument about fascism and its varieties of expression, and Brother Kevin speaking about, the way in which neoliberalism, conservatism, government and business, and then government and Christian dominion operates. When you put all that together, it's always a moment. You can never sustain beyond these episodes of epic reinvention occasioned by interventions that often cost lives, right? The season of assassinations that we witnessed in the 60s, Medgar, Malcolm, Martin, and then both Kennedys, right? All of that in the 60s, right? And untold women who were battered. I mean, think about Fannie Lou Hamer. A living assassination is what she endured in Mississippi. So the conditions of possibility are for us not to be able to sustain it is that not understanding, and it's like a heavyweight championship fight. And you might start off, man, you slugging, killing, oh, boom. Then the middle rounds, you're getting battered. You're getting beat up. And excuse me for using boxing. I know y'all UFC and UH and all that, but I'm the Muhammad Ali era and the Joe Frazier. So you're in a fight, but you're getting battered, and it looks pretty bad. You start off in 2020 with George Floyd. Oh, my God, everybody was convicted. You got black squares on Instagram. You got millions of dollars flowing into the coffers. And then predictably, not unpredictably, but predictably, the white supremacists and their allies, all lies, become centered in a moment of let's fight back. And so now Kimberle Crenshaw becomes the heart of the attack through intersectionality and CRT by a Georgetown graduate who lucks upon these ideas and sees this is something sexy that will sell to the hinterland and to white folk who are not educated about what the enemy is. That's strategy. That's understanding the moment. That's understanding you got to get in there and fight. Do you want the commercial or the product? Right? You got to make up your mind. You know, when you're parading around and leftists getting upset with other leftists, you're not left enough, you're not progressive enough. So you're killing each other while the real enemy is murdering you and slaughtering you. So I would, to answer your question then, I would say that when you think about the condition of possibility, it's to misunderstand and misapprehend how revolution works, how the moment right. King was, if you take Martin Luther King Jr. as the capstone and the avatar of social justice, he had a public career of 12 years, and that was extended. Fannie Lou Hamer, a little bit longer than that, but not much. Rosa Parks, not much. So it will always be a moment of fluid, digestible principles that can be absorbed by the masses that facilitate a mass revolution and a mass resistance that needs to occur, but always anticipate at the moment of your revolution, it ain't gonna last long. And what do we put into place to fight it? That's number one. Number two, as I've been sitting here listening to all of my brilliant colleagues, it just occurs to me that think about our foremothers and forefathers, our ancestors, the black ones. They ain't had no moment they could point to and say, hey, this is when it was better. Now look how messed up it is. What did they do? We have the privilege. It takes a certain kind of privilege to be cynical. It takes a certain kind of leisure to be hopeless. They ain't had no damn choice. They ain't had, oh, remember the 60 March on Washington and the 64 Civil Rights Bill and the 65 Voting Rights Act and the 68 Fair Housing. They ain't had none of that. So the question is, what did they do? Howard Thurman says, never reduce your dreams to the event you contemporarily confront. You're either going to be a prisoner of the event or you're going to be a prisoner of hope. And I think, and that's not just gobbledygook, that's not just the religious stuff. That's about a serious investment in strategies that will oppose the vicious fascism we confront. Now, on Saturday, I saw Professor Crenshaw at the Tennessee Democrats, right? About 1,000 folk who were gathered there. You'll be surprised, first of all, the number of the fans she's got. I mean, you're like, wow, damn. Like, right, wow. Y'all into CRT like that? You down with CRT? Yeah, you know me. So they were down with it, right? And it's her celebrity among them indicates to me that if we take advantage of redescribing what I like about her as an intellectual, don't stay in the damn ivory tower. If you want to learn something from the right wing, make that shit clear, make it digestible, and use analogies that they can understand so they can take it home and sell it to each other. And those of us on the left, in terms of the purity of our ideological commitments, don't understand we ain't got to have a commercial. Let's get the product involved. And we can, and I'll end by saying this. When we ask, when we talk about them going to school boards and stuff, the right wing understands this is retail politics, dog. This is on the ground. We have to roll up our sleeves, go to some of them board meetings, go to places we wouldn't ordinarily go, and then begin to talk to people. I got a George Strait jacket on. Now, I'm a big George Strait fan. All my exes live in Texas. That's why I hang my hat in Tennessee. For real, for real. So what's interesting is that at the George Strait concert, wearing my jacket around, a lot of white folks stopped me and said, oh my God, that's amazing. I love it. And then a lot of them said, I saw you on TV and I like what you're saying. Keep at it. I ain't think that the George Strait folk were going to be my natural, my natural allies, but don't allow your ideology to preclude identification with those. Martin Luther King Jr., I ain't here for real. Martin Luther King Jr. is in jail. And his jailers come to me, you're wrong. What you're doing, this stuff about integration is wrong. He said, no, not is right. And then he finally asked him, how much money do you make? And when they told him, he said, hell, you need to be out here marching with us. And when you can forge that connection, that's what I think we can do to make a difference. Forge connection with allies, find allies we didn't know, and then win this particular moment that we're in right now.
Mm. So, I promised to come back to you on the jujitsu moment, and you started a little bit. Let me problematize it a little bit more so we can grab that energy. So, you mentioned the attack on CRT, on 1619, on intersectionality. The reality is that some of the folks who helped facilitate that look like us. And basically we're looking at what might be called the politics of appeasement. Now, some part of the civil rights history that we don't talk about so much is that there were real conflicts, even back then, between those who wanted to go along and get along,
Right.
and the Martin Luther Kings and the Reverend Lafayette's, of the world.
Right.
And in reality, the ones who were on the appeasement side were trying to say, look, there are going to be costs associated with the confrontation. There are going to be costs in demanding more. We can get a little bit without suffering the consequences. I will say that in the whole debate about, whether Black Lives Matter gets taken out of the African American Studies curriculum, intersectionality, critical race theory, clearly what was said was, well, it sure is better to have a little bit of something than everything and nothing.
Sure.
So it really comes down to what is the function and purpose of a critical reflection of our history. It's not just about here's some facts and here's some firsts. And, we came from the West Coast of, and we're going to go look at the slave castles. I mean, there's that way of talking about the importance of history.
Right.
But if that was all there was, I don't think the Jason's Project would actually exist, because the history that they want to erase is a history that allows us to understand the context and contours of our situation.
Right.
So we're coming down to a moment where there's some of us who are about, no, this is about continuing the transformation. This is about the relay race. We ain't about trying to give a half-ass baton to the next generation. And what you're talking about is a half-ass baton. Yet the reality is those who are about the half-ass batons, they got power. So what's our thinking about what we do with the jujitsu moment with these folks?
Yeah, no. Well, first of all, you always have white supremacy by ventriloquism, right? You got a black mouth opening and white supremacist ideas being channeled. So I think your point there is extremely valuable, because it can't be reduced to skin fetish.
Mhm.
right? Your point that you began to quote from Zora Neale Hurston, all my kinfolk ain't my kinfolk. We know that. Every group can say that. Every gender can say that. Every sexual orientation can say that, because there are always going to be sellouts, if we can call it that, in that crude reductionistic term, but it fits in a certain sense. So the thing you got to remember is, again, you got to anticipate, you got to build that in your budget. Right, here's the sellout crew right here. This is what they're going to do. This is what they're going to say. And you got to remember, it's only ever a few. It ain't never the masses until the masses get taught by Professor Crenshaw. The masses get taught by these great professors here. All right, Professor Nancy, Professor Jason, Professor Kevin, right? Until the people began to hear it in the mass meetings, the reality is it ain't but a few. Most Black people didn't march in the civil rights movement, right? When I see them, when they beating up on young people, what you're doing, they say, show me the picture of you on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Oh, right. You weren't there, right? Most of us weren't there. Martin Luther King Jr. was an outlier, right? Fannie Lou Hamer was an outlier. Septima Clark was an outlier. These are people who imagined a different future and borrowed as a down payment on that social revolution the imagination that allowed them to talk to normal people about what they are up against. So then you began to explain it to them. Hey, I know you think you're against CRT, but are you for people being treated fairly? Yeah. Are you for people who think about history in a way that includes everybody's history? Well, yeah. Are you for people who think that in the larger budget of America, you got to make room for people who are poor or vulnerable and just, yeah. You just redescribing CRT. Now, you can call it what you want. At the end of the day, it's more important, again, for the product than the commercial. But you've got to do the hard work to break that down. Like Jesse Jackson once told me, if you say something I can't understand, that's a failure of your education, not mine. So now you got to figure out how to reach the people. And so this is, and again, it's only a few, right? Martin Luther King Jr. went to these meetings, it's like 60 people. There's extremely small. When Malcolm X is gathering, very few people. When Fannie Lou Hamer and James, when my man, people coming in from the South, from the North down to the South, these are small battalions of conscience. So never get discouraged when ain't a bunch of people in the room. You got to bring them into the room through your imagination and invite them to participate in what you already see. My pastor used to tell me, y'all ain't got to say amen. I was eating while I was cooking. So you got to eat while you cooking and invite people in to what you see as a revolutionary possibility. And you ain't always got to explain it that way. Because as Professor Crenshaw said, not only in terms of some of our own skinfolk, when I go out here in these churches and I'm preaching, I'm barely holding on to my faith because it's reactionary up in these spaces of religion. But then I go out here and go into some of these intellectual circles. I was like, damn, they got the church people beat, because they can be just as dogmatic, just as impervious to insight, just as classist, and refusing to acknowledge that if you speak to these people in a way they understand, you can bring them along. And I think at that level, that's what we got to do.
So that is exactly what we're about here at summer school. That is exactly what the four of you are going to be about over the next 4 days in summer school. Breaking it down, making it plain, giving access to ideas that help us say to others what is at stake. So in this last round, I want you to take up the challenge that Michael has put on the table. How do we make it plain? How do we frame what we've been talking about in ways that both in shed light on dimensions of the experience that may not be fully connected, but we want to be able to connect it and to be activating, not simply with, oh my God, but it does not have to be this way. Mm-hmm. And we have had historical moments where we were able to change the equation. So I'm going to go down and start with you, Jason, and pull us back this way. So what is the insight that you are articulating in clear, the elevator point, and how are you going to then dig deeper over the course of your mini course? So Jason.
Okay, those are two different questions. One
Yes.
is following this train of what we're going to do.
Yes.
And I want to stick with that because I think we have come up with, there's a sort of consensus growing. You have to bring people in because you cannot defeat a fascist movement one group at a time. Never happened, never. The Nazis were a minority party, but the left broke up into the Social Democrats, who the communists and the social and the people more left of them called the social fascists. So you don't want to be doing that. You don't want to be calling centrist Democrats fascists. I have friends who do that, and that is not the time for it. If we look right now, so we can ask what's new. One of the things that's puzzling about this time is what is new and what is old. There's a lot that's old, but there's some that's new. And we need to attend to that because the new thing, I think, is the complete removal of democracy as an ideal, as even a verbal ideal. Like if you look what Douglas does in the 19th century, he says, no, we're going to hang on to that rhetoric, as hypocritical as it is, and we're going to use it as a weapon. Well, soon we're not going to have that rhetoric as a weapon anymore.
And rule of law.
What?
And rule of law.
And rule of law is absolutely, like, you first go after the courts. The Nazis called it Gleichschaltung, coordination. You replace the courts by loyalists, number one. You replace the teachers by people parroting the party line. You replace the press. And it's just a paint by numbers. And we're seeing that paint by numbers. And that very clear paint by numbers is something relatively new. Now, I think another thing so how do we do this? Form coalitions across, me and a centrist Democrat. So I think interest convergence is something to do. We've seen one successful example in this. Poland beat back their far right authoritarian government. They got the social conservative. They had already replaced the judges. They got the social conservatives together with everybody else to preserve the rule of law. And so unfortunately that gets to the issues that we're talking about how much do we need to reach for the ideal versus how much we have to compromise in this state of emergency. And I don't know the answer to that question.
So what are you going to talk about in summer school?
What I'm going to talk about in summer school is the very direct ways in which education can control a population. So erasing history, like look at what's happening in Russia. Russia teaches in the textbooks there's no independent history of Ukraine. So they're like, no, there is no other thing there, Ukraine or other people. They're just Russians. So Russian people support the war because they're like, that's all fake. It goes very, very quickly. So we're going to look at some of those strategies and then look at some of the strategies of reclaiming history and how effective that is, like the hidden curriculum in the Jim Crow South that teachers kept alive.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So Kevin, just like Jason, there's the what is to be done and what are you going to do this week?
I'll say three things, and I think that the summer school is doing all of them. So I hope my contributions are helpful. I think one thing to be done is we need to name the moment. And I think about Paulo Freire. We were talking about Paulo Freire earlier, who wrote the great book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed in 1970. And one of the things he argues is that we shouldn't rush down a path too quickly to solve a problem until we first more deeply understand what that problem is. And he calls this reading the world. And I'm saying the phrase naming the moment. We need to really more deeply understand the problems. And so part of what I want to try to do in some of my sessions, like on Thursday morning, those of you who come to the enrichment workshop on Thursday morning, one of the things I'm going to try to do is connect the dots between 5 things that I don't think we're maybe always making connections between. About 5, AI, the Supreme Court ruling about EPA, and book banning? Like, how do they actually help us understand what's happening right now? So name the moment by connecting the dots, historicizing. I think the second thing is strategizing our intervention. And in the contributions I want to make with this is around how do we message and how do we communicate? So we're all talking about how we reach a much broader audience. And the problem that I want us to grapple with is how conventional wisdom tells us that education is about addressing a lack of knowledge. And I think what we need to really take seriously is that education is in large part about helping us grapple with a resistance to knowledge. And so what does that mean? How do we make sense of that? And what then is the intervention? So tomorrow morning, there's a session on public speaking, 9:30. And then I'll also do a how to write an op-ed session tomorrow at 4:15.
All right.
And then the fifth thing is self-care. I think we burn ourselves out. And I love that your summer school from the very beginning has been about community building and caring for the self. So this is sounding very self-promotional, but come at 8:45 to, there is a great dance session, but my session at 8:45 will be yoga and meditation. So come for yoga and meditation at 8:45, care for ourselves and connect with one another.
All right. Thank you, Kevin.
Can I just point out one quick thing? In Brazil, Bolsonaro ran trying to ban Paulo Freire.
Good company. Okay, Nancy.
All right, well, I am dating myself here, but I know there are some people of my vintage, let's just say, in the room who might remember something called the secret decoder ring that you could get with a box of cereal. Uh-huh.
I had
So,
many.
so I like that metaphor of a secret decoder ring because I think history kind of is a secret decoder ring that can be very helpful and powerful. So in our sessions, we are going to be looking to history that really informs our present. So we'll look at how vouchers came to be the preferred method to fight Brown versus Board of Education of the South's most arch segregationists and the early libertarians. They came together in the 1950s and fused the kind of coalition we see now. So we'll look at that and also at some of what's happening now, how we could use that knowledge. The second class is going to be about when the Black Revolution came to campus in the late 1960s and the creation of Black studies programs and opening up universities, affirmative action, new departments, et cetera, and the rights reaction to that. And their long-term, very sophisticated strategy for remaking higher education, including things like jacking up tuition so that students would be so debt burdened they'd be not wanting to protest. Anyway, so we'll look at how some of those things come together now and how that's also some of what happened there is the roots of the strategy we see being deployed with the attacks on CRT and DEI and so forth, but also what some groups are doing now to fight that, right? And to reclaim campuses and to deal with all of that. And then the third session, we're going to be looking at this long-term strategy of rules change that the right has pursued, and particularly the way they weaponized the racist reaction to the election of President Obama in 2008, reclaimed a bunch of state legislatures, bought them, like in Tennessee, with huge amounts of money, and went on to rig all the rules in these states, and also to capture the courts in the way that Jason was just describing, because if you capture the courts, you get to say what's okay and what's not, right? So we'll look at that, and again, look at how people are changing the courts, reclaiming the states and fighting for court accountability today. And then the last session will be about the two twin threats we face going into this all-important election. We'll talk more about Project 2025 and how to make it relevant to your communities, and also about the threat from the right of a constitutional convention if they manage to get Congress as well as the White House. So these are very serious generational world historic threats, but we also have ways to deal with them because we are the great majority. We forget that too easily. But so we'll talk about all of those things, but also ways in which we can resist all of this and finally break through this rigging of democracy to renew it, to make it so it serves all of our needs and purposes again. So it'll be a lot, but we're going to do a lot of discussing so that you'll have a sense of what you can bring back and how you can talk to people in just the brilliant way that Michael was talking about.
Brilliant, brilliant.
I want to go to yours.
We all want to go to yours.
Damn.
All right, Michael, what you gonna do?
So in the 4 sessions we have, we're going to look at some of the religious stuff, right? The white nationalism, the white dominionism. And one of the things is, I think the left often gives up too quickly on religion. I get it. It's messy. It's horrible. It's horrendous. Just like the academy, but we still here. Old preacher friend of mine used to say, yes, we're full of hypocrites. Come join us. There's room for one more. So the thing is, you got to figure out this religious language. And even if you ain't religious yourself, I got a lot of friends who are atheists who teach religion, right? Ain't no necessity to believe in God to study God, right? And God talk and God discourse. So the thing is, we're going to do a kind of genealogy, both according to Nietzsche and according to Foucault about it, and Du Bois especially, about how you take these ideas and talk about them, and how God was used to co-sign bigotry against a bunch of people, and then how the white nationalists have focused on a very narrow slither of what religion can possibly do. When Marx talked about it as the opiate of the masses, it's a far more complicated notion than we might believe. And then the second day, we'll talk about public policy, right? We'll try to rip off Professor MacLean and then figure out how we can adjust it to our situation. But we're going to talk about some of the public policies that are out here, and about how public policy has been used to wedge gaps between those of us inside, right? So you could be Kendrick Lamar saying, not like us. But the problem is, Kendrick, you and Drake get caught on the same day by the same cop. You ain't like them. So while you're trying to make divisive internal constructions, this is the misuse of the language of, right, you are a colonizer. I'm glad y'all reading, I hope you are Fanon or Paulo Freire, right, and the pedagogy of the oppressed, but read Antonio Gramsci. Pete Buttigieg's old man is one of the great interpreters and philosophers about Antonio Gramsci. And therefore, when Professor Stanley says, hey, we don't want to deal with a centrist versus a revolutionary, look at their family, not their family, they family, to understand what's happening. So we're going to probe those internecine squabbles between communities within progressivism to figure out what we can do. The third session will be on the ways in which education has been used pedagogically and structurally to convey misinformation. And we got Professor Gilman Whiting, one of the great scholars in American society on education. He's in the back. Raise your hand, Professor. Stand up so they can see you, man. I mean, stand up, stand up, stand up, stand up. We believe in beauty and brains. So he's going to be there discussing these issues. And in the fourth session, we're going to bring in Professor Tracy Sharpley Whiting as well to talk about the media and what happens as media are deployed to try to both colonize consciousness of citizens and the ways in which those strategies can be deployed to fight back against it. So, and then we'll bring in a brilliant graduate student, Royal Todd. Raise your hand over there, Professor Todd. We're just trying to win the week's a prize for having the most people in one session do what we do, and we believe in that kind of community. So that's what we're going to do. Mm-hmm.
So as I said, I wish I could go to all of them, and I actually wish I wasn't teaching one myself. But I'm teaching on intersectionality with a special emphasis on Say Her Name. We all know that with the recent killing of Sonia Massey, the vulnerability of Black women to police violence is a continuing real existential threat to our lives. So we will be talking about the various ways that we are called upon to bear witness to a vulnerability that does not get lifted up, either in discourses about violence against women or in discourses about violence against Black people. It is a classic intersectional gap that vulnerabilities that Black women face fall through. And until we are able to further and fully articulate that gap, there will be more Sonia Masseys happen. In fact, the Say Her Name Mothers Network has created a video for the next family that we have sent now to 4 different families, knowing that at some point, some other family is going to join the sorrowful sorority of survivors of police violence when basically they've been left without support, without resources, without recognition. So we'll talk about the origins of Say Her Name. We'll hear from 2 of the mothers who are going to be joining us, who are part of the Mothers Network. We'll talk about the role of ritual, the role of artivism, the deep dive into our culture, the ways that we remember in order to ensure that the women who've lost their lives are not remembered for the worst thing that ever happened to them. But despite that, what happened to them, they live on in who they were, what their aspirations were, what they wanted to be, what life might have been had they not had that encounter. So that's what we're going to do Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday. Tomorrow in homeroom, we're going to be joined by Ben Crump, who is going to talk about the Sonia Massey case. And my goal and my hope throughout is to link intersectionality and critical thinking about race to the concrete ways in which our lives are shaped by these factors. One of the simplest ways that I try to explain to people what is critical race theory is what we all as Black people have been taught to do when we see those sirens in our rear view mirror. We know not to take any fast action. We know to put our hands at 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock on the steering wheel. We know to move slowly when we retrieve our licenses. This is practicing critical race theory. We have a theory based on an experience that our encounter with a police officer is not going to be the same as someone who's embodied in a different body. That is critical reflection on who we are in a society shaped by anti-Black racism. That's what it is. So the course is going to lift up those realities, assure that we understand why it's important to frame these issues through a historical lens that is grounded in what actually has happened and what will continue to happen unless we can intervene through policies that pay attention to race rather than bow to color blindness. So that's what's on tap for all of us in the intensives. There are also other virtual courses that are happening over the course of the week. But before we do anything, please join me in thanking our amazing panelists, Jason, Kevin, Nancy, and Mike.
I'm coming to yours.
And now I'm going to turn it over to Glenda Smiley.
Yeah, we just won't talk. That's a great conversation.
Yeah.
That's a good idea.
Thank you, Professor Crenshaw. Hi, everyone. I'm Glenda Smiley, your Dean of Students, and also Director of Program and Advocacy here at the African American Policy Forum. I want to thank our amazing speakers and Professor Crenshaw for guiding us through this important and inspiring conversation. It has been so insightful to discuss how to forge connections with our histories, values, and imagine futures to fight the power. Have you all been inspired? All right now. Very good, very good. I've been tapped to elevate what's next in our beautifully abundant and rich and robust schedule for CRT Summer School. So following this plenary, I think it's important to say there is going to be a brief break, right? So that you can take care of yourselves before heading to these amazing intensives with our professors. Then after your intensives, from 4:15 to 5:15, we'll have 2 sessions. The first is office hours, or the 3-2-1, with Professors Harris and Thomas. That will take place over in Lasky. And Professor Luke Harris and Ann Thomas will lead this at the end of the day. It'll be a rich discussion on what's new, what's exciting, and what you can use. We want you to bring your questions, learn from your colleagues, and practice your talking points. Each day's conversation will be different, taking the plenaries as a starting point. Many of you should have received a Google form, right? To start tracking your notes for your 3-2-1. Very good. The other session is Scholars and Friends Lounge, building the next generation of CRT scholars and civil rights leaders, previewing the year ahead with Professor Sumi Cho and your Associate Dean of Students, Tala Baptiste. We'll also have other guest speakers throughout the week, including Tiffany Fontenot, Miles Hollingsworth, Karen Keys, and Regina Thomas. After those sessions, we will have dinner in the dining hall from 5:30 to 6:30. And there will be a brief break after dinner from 6:30 to 7, and then we'll have our evening closing session from 7 to 8, also over at Lasky Great Hall. It's important to note that content will be available on demand for those who are watching us virtually. If you happen to miss last night's amazing opening plenary session. And access to how to watch will be shared on our social media channels. So follow us at AA Policy Forum on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Thank you so much.